Welcome to this presentation on water, our greatest resource. I'm Christy Bartolo, the agronomy agent at the Pueblo County CSU Extension Office. Let's get started with some statistics about water. 70% of fresh water is used in agriculture. That's nationally. All of our so of the 100% of fresh water that the United States has, 70% of that is devoted to agriculture. And Colorado specifically consumes 98% of our available fresh water. Approximately 72% of total water applied as irrigation comes from surface water flows in the mountain region, and that pretty much includes the entire Rocky Mountain range from New Mexico to Montana. So it's not totally representative of Colorado or Pueblo for any matter of that. But compared to the rest of the United States, compared to the Midwest and the East Coast, those folks are using more groundwater, well water, and we are using more surface water. That's because we have snowpack and we get our water that way. Approximately 5.5 acre feet of per acre irrigation water is used, again, in that same mountain region. So per acre, 5.5 acre feet. So basically over that acre, 5.5 feet of water is used. And specifically 2.5 of that acre feet is for vegetable production. So there's a whole bunch of variety of crops that can be irrigated, whether it's hay, alfalfa, feed corn, sorghum, millet, whatever it is. But specifically, and most importantly for Pueblo County, vegetable production is a super big and important component, and 2.5 acre feet per acre of irrigation water is used for vegetable production. To put that into perspective, over 18,000 acres are irrigated in Pueblo County, and that's all through, or mostly through, furrow irrigation. So where does our water come from? Our water is coming from the Arkansas River Basin, and that starts up in the mountains of Leadville, Colorado, way up there where the snowpack starts to melt. It flows down the Arkansas River, getting stopped and diverted in various places along the way. All of the irrigation water for Pueblo County is stored in the Pueblo Reservoir, or Lake Pueblo. That water then gets transferred to the eastern end of the county for all of the farmers out that way through what's called the Bessemer Ditch. So because water is such an important resource, everybody needs water. It's got to be divvied into about 1,000 different uses. And so there's definitely challenges when we're managing water. Some of these challenges include increased demand by urban users as cities and towns grow and increase in population. Those folks still need drinking water. They still need water to shower, water their lawns. All of these things are important. So water has to be allocated for those folks. The expansion of the energy sector, hydropower and various other forms of providing energy and electricity require large amounts of water. In-stream flows have to remain at certain levels, not only for environmental impact, but also for recreation. So we like to see our kayakers here having a good time on the river at the Pueblo Whitewater Park. And they can only do that with high enough water flows, and also fish need to be able to sustain in high enough water flows. The bigger probably challenges is that water is becoming scarce, right? We're seeing more and more drought. We're seeing climate change. So wild storms, extremely hot temperatures and then extremely cold temperatures and lack of precipitation and then a deluge. And so lots of really, really wild changes. And then also the cost of water is going up. It's always rising. It's always more costly to use the water as it becomes more scarce. Because of the scarcity and the many different ways that water needs to be used, there's certainly a big push for conserving water. And basically that's just saving water, using less of it. And this can happen in your very own house. So shut off the water while you're brushing your teeth, or don't run the water while you're washing dishes, various things like that. But more importantly, because agriculture is a large user of our fresh water, how can we implement water conservation in agriculture? And so this is going to mean changing our irrigation methods and some of our farming practices to implement those kinds of things. Some water conservation techniques include things like planting drought-tolerant crops. So there's some, even in vegetable production, there's some varieties that are a little less susceptible to drought, and so they can withstand being irrigated less. So that would save water. Using crop residue for ground cover. So if you planted your corn and you harvested and there's still residue on the ground, maybe leave that residue through the winter so that any precipitation we do get has a better chance of actually staying in the ground and not evaporating off or getting lost in other ways. And so that adding moisture to the soil from any precipitation that falls allows there to be moisture for the next year's plants, the next year's seeds, which means you potentially could use less water, less irrigation water. Building soil structure is another important component, not only of soil health, but for water conservation. The more structure, so the more aggregates or PEDs you have in your soil, in your soil profile, the better and the easier it is for water to actually stay and stick around. It'll actually be there in the root zone as opposed to percolating down to the groundwater or evaporating off the surface. Implementing more efficient irrigation methods, which is often difficult to do just due to what is currently being used, what is currently the most efficient method or the most prominent way of convening water. Like I said, in Pueblo County, furrow irrigation is the most common. You will see some center pivots and some drip irrigation, but not nearly as much as furrow irrigation. And so with that, thinking about furrow irrigation, it is somewhere between 30 and 60% efficient, meaning that water gets to the plant 30 to 60% of the time. The rest of the water that's applied either percolates down past the plant root zone or evaporates off the surface. Other irrigation methods, including drip, are much more efficient. They provide water directly to the plant, and so they're somewhere in the 80 to 90% efficiency range. And it inherently uses less water because less water is poured into the field. So those are different irrigation methods. Like I said, difficult to use or difficult to switch irrigation methods. So have to consider what your farm is like to actually implement these particular things. Using the 72-hour rule for water storage. So maybe your crops don't necessarily need to be irrigated the day that it's your turn to get the water. So hold on to that water for a couple more days, maybe in a pond or in a low area of your farm, and then pump that water out to your fields when your fields need it. And instead of just using the water every single time you have a turn, maybe store some of it and then use it when your plants actually need it. And then the last one, avoid irrigating weeds. And seems kind of like a common sense or a silly concept for conserving water, but if you think about 100 acres of a field and there's 2 weeds for every plant that you want to plant, you're certainly going to be irrigating more weeds than you are your crop. So the less weeds you can have in your field, the better off you're going to be. And definitely a water conservation technique for sure. Well, when we think about water conservation, we can think about irrigation and break down its efficiency just a little bit more as a thought, to broaden the thought on how to be more efficient in irrigation. A couple different things for irrigation water use efficiency. That's going to be the measure to help characterize water conservation potential of irrigation systems and the broader irrigation sector. So we're going to talk about irrigation efficiency, and this is just the share of all irrigation water applied to a field that's beneficially used by the crop. Beneficial use is predominantly accomplished by using evapotranspiration by crops and salt removal to aid in soil productivity. Non-beneficial uses may include losses, excessive evaporation, field runoff, deep percolation, and weed consumption. So irrigation efficiency basically is, what is your plant getting? What are your crop plants getting from your water? Application efficiency. So this one is the ratio of average depth of irrigation water infiltrated and stored in the root zone for crop consumptive use to the average depth of irrigation water applied. So you stick on a certain amount of water, maybe you stick on an acre foot of what irrigation water, maybe half an acre foot. And irrigation efficiency wise, you're using furrow irrigation, so it may not be quite as efficient, but you've applied this water. And so how much of that water is going to stay within the root zone? How long can your plant utilize the water, that acre foot or that half acre foot that you placed on your land there? Conveyance efficiency. This is kind of the last two are kind of broad spectrum, more or less. Conveyance efficiency, you can think about in the ways, how is the irrigation water getting to you, and then how are you conveying it to your land? So in a wide open surface water conveyance system like the Bessemer Ditch, coming all the way from Pueblo Reservoir down to the eastern end of the county, it's a wide open ditch, lots of irrigation in the dead heat of a July summer in Pueblo. It's 100 degrees, a lot of evaporation is occurring off of that ditch. So that could potentially lead to less efficient water conveyance. And same likewise on the farm, if you're using open ditches, letting water, having a bunch of leaks everywhere, your conveyance efficiency is probably limited. So think about things like using underground pipe and gated pipe instead of siphons and whatnot. It's a little bit more difficult to convince, to have the larger system like the Bessemer Ditch be converted. But there is the possibility to help your conveyance efficiency on your own farm. The last one is basin efficiency. This is the ratio of irrigation water beneficially used compared to the total volume of fresh water consumed in the basin. So this is basically your farm pitted against all of the rest of the farms in the basin. So this is the Arkansas River Valley Basin. And what you're doing, are you more efficient than your neighbor? Think about it this way. If you've got more acres and you're using more water, well, that makes sense. You've got more land, more crops to irrigate. But if you've got less acres, less crop, and you're irrigating more than maybe your neighbor with same amount, you might want to consider that changing some of your efficiencies to be a little more water conservative. And the big bummer here, drought. Unfortunately, drought is much more common now. We're seeing it a lot more often. Oftentimes in Pueblo, in the Pueblo area, we'll see drought 4 to 5 times every decade. Unfortunately, that number seems to be increasing through the years, and as the climate is changing and warming up, we're seeing drought a lot more often, not nearly as much precipitation. At the beginning of December, we were really concerned about the snowpack in the mountains, seeing that it was really low. Thankfully, lots of storms have come through and aided that. I think the Arkansas River basins, the mountains in Leadville are still sub average at the current moment. And we haven't received hardly any precipitation, really any notable precipitation. And so we're certainly going to expect this year to be much more droughty. Less precipitation, probably pretty hot, but something to think about in drought. What are you going to do? What's your drought plan? Various things like fallowing, extra use of well water, any other conservation techniques that we had mentioned, like using those drought tolerant crops or planting those drought tolerant crops. So think about what you've done in the past, and that can help you develop a plan for what to do in the future in the face of drought. We certainly will be seeing less or much more metered use of well water, so there won't be as much well water coming through. There also might be not as much irrigation water coming down the Bessemer ditch. So think about how many crops you want to plant, what it is you want to plant. Maybe you switch from feed corn to sorghum in an effort to save some water. Sorghum typically needs less water. So consider those kinds of things when you're figuring that out. Probably will have a better idea of what's coming down the line, how much irrigation water everybody will actually get in March or April when snow melt starts to occur. So that'll be good. And so now into the bigger issues. Water law, let's discuss a little bit a review of Colorado water law, and we'll get into the anti-investment speculation situation that's coming down the pike. So Colorado water law, in Colorado, water is public domain. So the citizens of Colorado, quote unquote, own the water of Colorado. And it is a first in time, first in right system. So if somebody purchases a right to use that water, they have, before somebody else, they would be receiving the water before the other person. So the first person is a senior right. People later down the line who purchased water rights later on have junior water rights, and always the senior water right holders will receive their irrigation water more and before any junior rights do. Users can purchase the right to divert and use water from a natural resource. It has to be for beneficial use. It cannot be held, hoarded, maintained. It can't be left down the stream. It must be diverted and used for a beneficial purpose. And beneficial use can be a whole variety of things, even in including leaving water for in-stream flow. So that can happen. But it also is oftentimes, being diverted for agricultural use. Rights can be obtained for groundwater, for storage, and for surface water. If you have a right to store some water, that way, sometimes that's a good mitigation, sometimes that's a good drought plan, sometimes that's a good mitigation plan or water conservation plan. So it just depends on what your farm can do. So here's the definition of the anti-investment speculation. This is actually coming from the report that the work group on Senate Bill 48 put together. It was quite an extensive report on the proposed anti-investment speculation bill, and it's actually Bill B. That is the anti-investment speculation bill. It seems to be that it's going to be undergoing some rewriting and revisions, but at the current moment, this is what the anti-investment water speculation bill states. The appropriation or purchase of water rights, followed by the use of those water rights where the appropriator or purchaser's primary purpose is profiting from increased value of the water in a subsequent transaction, such as sale, lease, or payment for non-diversion. The profit is derived solely from forces of supply and demand and not from added value. So the anti-investment speculation is essentially looking to stop any kind of purchase of a water right for profitable sale. Okay, we'll dive into what that actually means, the various facets of that. Within this particular bill, public water providers, so lots municipalities would be provided greater flexibility. So they would be able to purchase water rights regardless, and the bill wouldn't call it investment speculation. These public water providers are providing the municipalities with water, and they typically look up a projected or have some sort of projected population growth for the future, even up to 50 years. They're thinking about how much water they're going to need, and so this bill would allow them to purchase pretty much as much water as they want. Typically, that would be coming off of agricultural land, to be able to compensate for a growing population. And the bill wouldn't call it speculation. It would prohibit or penalize any compensation for non-diversion. So somebody who pays another person for saying, hey, don't divert the water, let it send it down the line. Either person would be penalized for that to be happening. Unless irrigated land is going to be changed to a new land use, the water will be required to be tied to that land. And this is somewhat, this kind of blends into the conservation, like land conservation realm. Water that's on a piece of property can't, so in current Colorado water law, no matter where your water is or what your water is doing, that water can be changed from possibly agricultural use to municipal use, or from municipal use and vice versa back to agricultural use, or for riparian use, or for in-stream flow. So with this bill, if that piece of property stays an agricultural piece of property, that water has to stay agricultural. If that piece of property is subdivided and homes are going to go on it, then the water that's on there has to remain for those homes in the subdivision. So water at that point couldn't be transferred until the land is transferred to some other use. It would establish a maximum rate of water right price increase and impose higher taxes when the rate is exceeded. So purchasing water would be capped, the price of purchasing water would be capped and taxes would be imposed. And then the last one, which could potentially change how water is used, it would limit the number of water rights a single owner can hold. So if some agricultural producer wants to come through and purchase water rights, they'll be capped. So typically private owners of water rights will be capped. Those municipalities will have greater flexibility, less of a cap. So thinking about those kinds of things. Like I said, it's gonna, this particular bill would kind of change how water is used and managed in Colorado, with many more things having the potential to be considered speculation, and larger fines and various things like that to put agricultural producers that could be detrimental, as they don't have the funds to combat those sorts of speculations, I suppose. So other things to consider, well use. So review on wells in Colorado. Small wells are going to be anything that's less than or equal to 50 gallons per minute. This is going to be for your household or your livestock use up to 1 acre. And so those kinds of wells don't need any, they need to be permitted, of course, but they don't need any augmentation. Anything over that 50 gallon per minute limit must provide augmentation. So there must be some way, if you use that extra over that 50 gallons per minute of water, there must be some way for you to compensate for that. And that's where the augmentation water comes in. There's various companies that provide that augmentation water. And wells are going to be applied through the state engineer. One thing to note is that the anti-investment speculation would apply to groundwater. So any rights you're looking to purchase for well use would, that anti-investment speculation would apply to that. Because of the low snowpack and the lack of precipitation that we're seeing in 2022, or end of 2021, beginning of 2022, we're most likely well water use will be restricted, or much more highly metered, so less well water will be available. That likewise storage in the reservoirs from the top of the Arkansas River Basin down all the way to the valley. Water storage is around half of its total capacity, and certainly water districts are going to want to get those reservoirs filled back up. So that will mean less irrigation water be coming down the ditch. Here are some useful resources, various different, the Southeast Colorado Conservation District, Water Conservation District has a great bunch of resources about water, about the Arkansas River, Quagmit. This is going to be the weather, the CSU weather station web page. They've got lots of great information as well. It helps you kind of keep an idea on the weather. Watching the weather does help in planning, especially for things like drought and whatnot. Various websites in regards to the water issues as well. That is about that. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Feel free to reach out to me. My number is 719-583-6576, or shoot me an email that's at bartolok@pueblocounty.us. Thanks for joining us.